Hi, everyone, and welcome to the MOG Effect, Inside the Chaos and How to Gain Clarity when Managing Government Digital Transformation, the podcast where we unpack how government restructures impact digital teams, platforms, and the public. So, hello, I'm Akhil Vandari. I'm with Salsa Digital, and I've been with Salsa Digital for 6 years now, but worked with the Department of Communications with the Australian Public Service in federal government for 8 years before that.
Thanks, Akhil. And I'm Julia Topless. I'm digital practice lead at Salsa Digital. And prior to that, I've worked for probably about 5 years on government platforms. And before that, I ran my own digital agency for over 20 years. So we are your friendly co hosts. And in this first episode, we're setting the stage by asking the big question: what is a machinery of government change, or more affectionately known within the circuit, a MOG, and why should digital teams care? So we're going to kick off with some of the basics. So, Kill, for listeners who may not be familiar,
Mhm.
what exactly is a machinery of government change, or MOG?
Excellent question. So the definition of a machinery of government change, or MOG, is within the Australian government anyway, is that any decision made by the Prime Minister or Cabinet that reorganises how Commonwealth responsibilities, functions, resources, and people or staff are allocated across agencies and portfolios.
So that sounds like a whole lot of admin reshuffling, but under the hood, it's a lot more complex, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. It can be triggered by a few different things. I've had a few different situations which trigger a MOG, but generally it's triggered by the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and it's an amendment to the Administrative Arrangement Orders, or the AAO, about specific functions of government, resources, budgets, or staffing changes. One of the most obvious ones is an election. So that's where there's a potential change. But often what happens is, and we've seen this, is sometimes a minister might retire. So that and the head of that portfolio or that minister, once they retire, that portfolio has to either have a new minister or potentially gets mogged, it gets moved or absorbed by another minister within their portfolio. So that's quite a common change that we see.
Right. So, um, can you do you have an example of like your own experience with a MOG while you were working in government?
Yes, definitely do. So often what happens is, if there's a new department or a portfolio, either changing or closing, or even when there's a merge of entities, these things can cause a MOG, as well as, change in the structure itself and the status of department. So when I was with Department of Communications, I actually started off. It was called the Department of Broadband Communications and Digital Economy, so DBCDE. And that was only for a couple of years, and then that was changed when there was an election, I think it was, and then the digital economy was changed, and it was just basically shortened to Department of Communications, and the digital economy, and I think then it was shortened to Department of Communications. And then we had another MOG with the Department of Arts, for the arts sector, came into communications, and we were called the Department of Communications for the Arts. So yeah, been through a few different MOGs over the years while I was at Department of Communications, even though I just still call it communications.
So even you speaking about all of that, it sounds like pretty messy. Like, my head is spinning right around overlapping content, outdated pages, like all that kind of technical stuff under the hood.
Yeah.
Can you just like comment um, on that kind of the potential size and the mess and how you handle all of that kind of chaos that's coming onto you? Because I think one of the other things that you sort of mentioned to me recently was that you've got a very short period of time to action all of this.
Yeah, so it definitely varies on the complexity, and when those things kind of happen, it's like shaking a snow globe, right? Everything kind of was set in its way and then gets completely mixed up and stirred around potentially. So depending on the size and complexity of the MOG, can determine the impact of it. So smaller departments often get absorbed into larger departments, the lead department generally. and that includes the internal services, so like corporate services. Each department generally has a corporate services area to, look after their HR, to look after their internet, their IT services and other areas, finances, for example. But if there are two organizations or two departments, they don't need to have two finance areas, two of everything. So sometimes one will either be disbanded or absorbed into a larger department, or if the larger department can manage the workload that gets added, then that other one gets expanded. So it really does depend on the size of the change, the size of the departments, and things like that. So that's just on the corporate side of things. But then the content that's also around the work, or sorry, around the content that's around in those websites is also quite extreme as well in some cases.
And I guess this is the thing, right? Like, so my experience at MOG has been purely in digital,
Yeah.
but really it's bigger than that, right? Digital is just one small component of a
Yes.
whole lot of change that's happening. So, staff are changing places, staff are coming in, I assume, some are exiting, but then branding is changing as well.
Yeah. I mean, just
And,
just
and
on
I'm
the
just
like.
trying to think in my head, like, what happens in the department when a MOG is called.
Yeah, so even just on the location or on the changes themselves and the structures, right? So when I was at Comms, we were in the Nishi building in Canberra, but when we were mogged with Department of Infrastructure, they had other offices. So our teams were actually separated. So we were split apart depending on our function. Some teams were moved physically to another building, whilst others stayed. And then eventually, depending on your mog, you could actually stay in that building or actually go to a different office. So there's other impacts about, where do you work, where the new office might be, how close is it to your house, etc. Could be good or bad. But in terms of yeah, content and other things and digital side of things, that also kind of quite detailed. So it's kind of the first area where, from a citizen's point of view, they will see some of the cracks appearing potentially and changes there. So, content that used to make sense was coherent can change, agency names can change. So, like as I mentioned, the DBCDE changed to something shorter, communications, comms and arts. Now, I think it's Department of Infrastructure, etc. Like the names change constantly. So those types of things that need to be updated on the website. Obviously the joke is around the different stationery that has to change every business cards and other things, and the building label, the naming on the building has to change as well. But the content itself is a huge one, and so things from the look and feel, the branding can change. But one of the bigger ones is, some departments have specific brand voice or brand style guides that they write to. So the content and writing styles can change potentially or need to have alignment. And that will then be determined by the amount of content that gets changed. Is it just a few pages? Is it just sections? Does that portfolio change if it's smaller only represent a small amount of content, or is there a lot of complex content? Some of it's legislative, so it has to stay there or has to be available online. How much content's moving? Does that need to be rewritten? Does it need to be changed anyway? There's quite a lot of consideration in the content style as well as the content itself that needs to be looked at and reviewed across that change. So, there's also potentially, content that is abandoned or orphaned. Does that need to stay? Does that need to shift? And then some of that comes down to the content owners themselves, right? Who are the content owners? Does that section department still remain within the new MOG or the old or the other team? So you'll have content potentially coming in, but you also have content getting shifted out. So, you have to segment that content and make that available to the other receiving department as well.
So what I'm hearing, right, is that the people who are responsible for the digital presence for these departments, it's like a really super stressful time for them anyway. Like there's a lot changing in their world in terms of their jobs, where they're working, who they're working for, um, you know, changing of roles, changing of people that they're working with. So, what do you think these teams should be doing first once they know a MOG? So like for at the moment, right, we're in caretaker mode. So what do you think these digital teams should be thinking about now?
Yeah, so there's a lot to consider. I mean, while there's caretaker on, there's not much they should be doing from a content change point of view. But I do think that the caretaker mode does provide a really good opportunity, even if there's potentially no MOG changes. It's a great opportunity while there's minimal publishing activity to do a content audit. Consider what the content is. Some agencies and some departments have a regular content review process, which is either quarterly or 6 monthly to have a look at the content, make sure it's up to date, make sure the content that needs to be removed does get removed if it's only kind of temporary content. Um, but another opportunity to, identify who the content owners are within the department. That's really good from the digital team point of view to make sure that if there is an area of content that does end up moving out or gets changed in any way, they can find those owners quickly to make those changes quickly when and if it does happen. I mean, that's good practice both on the preparation and just the management side of content in general. So there are some steps that the digital teams can take, and that kind of is a good kind of best practice, a window for good practice to be done while that low publishing activity is happening.
Yeah, and from what I've seen, like that content governance challenge is a really big challenge, right? Like a lot of these sites have got pages that have been there for many, many years. There's no kind of review process in place, um, and they're still kind of hanging out there. Like, how would you recommend that people tackle what can often be like thousands and thousands of pages, right? Like, what would be the first step that you would take, right, to try and tackle that problem?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, especially when there's thousands of pages. It's one of those things where, how do you eat an elephant? It's like one bite at a time.
Yeah, yeah.
You
I
you
love that
definitely
saying.
should, me too,
Hats off to
especially with
Desmond
thousands.
Tutu, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So, when you have your large site and it does have thousands of pages, really doesn't need to have thousands of pages. A good site doesn't need to have lots of content. Basically, we've found when I was working at Comms that we kind of divided content into things that need to stay on the site for a reason, like
Mm.
legislature, or it has to be there, versus things that are kind of transient, which is mostly content that's like news, media releases and everything else that kind of is, a point in time kind of information. The information that needs to stay there, it doesn't always, it only needs to be there for, the time that it needs to be there. So if there's a program that's running, it should be taken down at the end of the program. If it's still relevant in a year's time, keep it there. So there's a review process of looking at content, a content lifecycle process and content strategy around all the content that's there. So, make sure that it's reviewed regularly so that there isn't a pileup of thousands of pages or thousands of pages of content. Sometimes those thousands should generally be like media releases, things that kind of accumulate over time. Maybe you want to archive things that are older than a certain time, if that's possible, depending on your requirements and mandate for the particular department of reporting. But when there is so much content, yeah, it's probably one way to tackle it is looking at it from an age point of view. So look at the latest year content. So look at the last year of content, 2 years, and anything older than 5 years, you can maybe either move to archive or just change or look at slowly. And ideally, all content gets reviewed at some point. But yes, having thousands of pages is difficult. That's where potentially, if you have distributed publishing or at least content owners that you know of, spread out through the department, you can kind of split, divide the task and get them to look at the content that they own. And hopefully that'll take a bit of the burden off the central publishing team.
So, like a divide and conquer approach.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
nice. Okay, so to wrap up, if you had to give digital teams one key piece of advice when it comes to a mob transition, what would that be?
Oh, one piece of advice. I mean, I've got a few different things. I mean, generally speaking, so a MOG change is a change in the mechanism by which government shapes administrative machinery, but that changes, the needs of the day. And the complexity and structural changes that happen, whether it's just one department or a portfolio being absorbed, or two large departments being split or even moved together, right? That does impact how much change and what needs to be done. But knowing who the lead agency is, because sometimes they'll have more sway on what content stays and goes. So knowing that, working with the different between the two departments, potentially another publishing team or digital web administrative team, working with them to understand what they find is a priority content as well. They'll be familiar with their own content, and that can help with determining what stays and goes if it needs to. Also knowing if there's any new content that might need to be written, or if there's a restructure of the IA, which also will impact or could impact the content work as well. That's a big thing, is to know whether or not the department is staying. So often what can happen is what we did with comms, Department of Communications, and also with the arts. We kept the site separate. Department of Communications had their site for a while. Department of Arts still had their own URL and brand. The brand was aligned, but they had their own URL. So keeping the structures were separate, which made it easier when there was the MOGs. But in some cases, the structure or IA, information architecture, navigation structure, has to be reintegrated into a larger one, and that can be quite a bit of work in itself. So those are the other considerations. And the last one is probably that brand style or writing style, understanding whether that's going to be impacted on the existing content. And then the other things are just the brand logos and things. If you've got to bring content in, is there branding or styling changes that might be impacted?
Thank you, Akil. I feel like you gave us a whole lot more than just the one main thing, but awesome foundation for this series. So just talking about what's coming up for us. So our next episode is going to be a dive into working out who owns content. So I think that's one not to be missed next. So you've been listening to The MOG Effect. Subscribe where you get your podcasts. And if you got a MOG story of your own, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay calm and keep redirecting.